Arun's going to take us through the journey DeakinPrime's been on from an innovation perspective, particularly in relation to using design thinking. And I suppose this journey probably started a little over 18 months ago, but gained some momentum when I was fortunate enough to be in the States last year and had an opportunity to visit Stanford's design school, or D school as it's known. I was sure to get plenty of photos to make Arun very jealous, which I sent back. But for those of you not familiar with design school out of Stanford, it's really where the design thinking concept originated, if you like, and very much reasonably mainstream now in terms of how organisations approach product design for consumers. Where it's less used, and I suppose where we've adapted it, and as have many others, is around using it as a technique, if you like, to look at a learner-centric approach to how we design our learning programs. And I think that the shift that we've seen is taking looking sort of to shift the outcomes or pivot the outcomes from historically or traditionally looking to design programs that deliver learning outcomes to designing programs that provide performance outcomes. And it's a really interesting exercise to go through where you don't go in necessarily with a predetermined, okay, we've got a blended learning course that's somehow going to be shaped and fitted into what we're going to do here. The outcome could be fairly or completely different based on how you analyse this from a design thinking perspective. I was also fortunate while I was there to spend some time with a business in San Francisco, a learning business that had very much embraced design thinking. And they were doing a project for one of the car companies over there who'd had a lot of challenges with the complexity of the computer system in their car. So people would buy this new car and they'd get all these calls because people couldn't work out how to turn the navigation system on or what this flashing light meant. And they were engaged initially to design what was probably going to be some e-learning modules, a bit of instructive material. And they stepped me through the process, which was really comprehensive, and the solution that ended up as an app on the phone, which there's nothing earth-shattering about that, but the thought process or the iterative process that they went through to get to that outcome, I just thought this is something that we really need to be embracing ourselves. And Arun had already started that thinking and that journey, and I suppose with encouragement we've gone down that path and seen some really outstanding results in terms of some of the projects. So Arun always is well received. He's a very energetic, passionate speaker, a self-confessed learning nerd. I think I can say that. I think you say that. Many of you probably will have seen some of his work on the blogs, but he's a great contributor to the learning community. So without further ado, welcome Arun up to the microphone.
Thanks very much, Simon. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I know, as Simon said to me at the beginning, it's not like, we've got heaps of time. I know everyone's time poor, and the fact that you've actually come out today is a great honour from my perspective that you've taken the time to come and be part of this presentation and hopefully be part of this discussion as we move forward to a more human-centred approach to innovation. So I'll just kick straight in. What I was going to cover today was 4 key topics. Firstly, why innovate learning? And I know the people in this room know that already, but I think it's useful to go through some of the arguments around it to support your business cases and to support the sort of change you're trying to make in your own organisations. What some of the learning innovation looks like at the moment, and then I was going to go into design thinking more from a general point of view before finally going into how we're using design thinking, which is we're adapting it slightly in the context of providing learning solutions. So firstly, why innovate learning? And I think it's a good place to get a bit of a reality check and just sort of ask, where is L&D, where are learning and development people today? And I know not all of you are learning and development people, but certainly those of us who are in that sort of space, I think this is probably a familiar role, that we're the order takers, that there's something wrong. People come, pick up the phone and say, we want, you know what they ask for is basically the course or the e-learning module. And they pretty much ask for a package. Like, they see learning as a thing that can be put in a container and shipped out, and that's what you're there for. You're there to get this package and to give it to their audience group. At best, they allow us to do some interesting packaging. They might say, oh yeah, you can do gamification, or you can do some kind of a bit more inventive, interactive elements to your e-learning, or you can break up these workshops and do something a bit different. But at the end of the day, it's still packaged learning, and it's still conceiving of what we do as putting a product in a container and serving it. When the reality, I think most people here would have experienced this, the reality of what learning actually is quite different. It's an organic process that happens in ways that we don't expect. Like even here, the fact that most of you are going to forget, even if you feel good about this presentation when you walk out, you're going to forget it. Let's just face it now, you're going to forget it. Unless you apply it, unless it's actually already part of your thinking, your mental models now, and it's actually just sort of reinforcing elements of it, unless you're actually engaged with conversations with other people about it, unless you're applying something out of this workshop pretty much in the next 24 to 48 hours, you're going to forget it. So it's amazing how much people think, yeah, that was a great presentation, and yet nothing's. I taught at uni for 6 years, and I've met students. I still meet students today, and I keep asking them, "What do you actually remember?" They say, "Oh, you were a brilliant lecturer. You're great. You're great." So, what did you actually remember from what I showed you? And there's just this like 2-minute awkward pause, and it's like, I really spent 6 years of my life doing that. So at least, yeah, they get the warm and fuzzies, but they just that sort of stickability is still not there. So I think what I did give them was the networks and the collaborative groups and that sort of structure. So the fact that learning is way more complicated and happens much more organically is a first point for us all, a first point of departure for all of us. It's becoming more of an issue now. I've talked before. I recognise a few faces from another presentation I did. I talk about half jokingly about how our role really is to save people from the robot apocalypse. The fact that knowledge, which is what L&D has traditionally focused on, is now just that simple knowledge where we're just trying to remember and put facts in our brains is being replaced by automation, by smart computing and AI, and it's becoming less and less an issue. Like the fact that us trying to remember things is becoming less of an issue. What's more of an issue is know how and know who. This was always the case, but it's becoming more to the fore now. That know how is that more tacit ability to make a decision, to reach a decision point without even knowing how you actually did that. But it's just come through those years of experience of seeing particular, like even someone who's been facilitating, I wish I had this experience, to know how to read a room properly, so when they are getting bored, probably don't, it's not, I would have to go through a checklist to do it, and it's still not quite the same, but that sort of tacit experience to be able to understand how to adapt what you're doing, how to work differently. And know who, which is about the collaborative networks, that's really coming to the fore now, particularly aided through technology. And knowledge, that sort of more formal element, is still important, but really, I mean, I joked at a presentation I did a little while ago where I talked about our job really should be to kill knowledge in people's brains. And I know that's a bit sort of blasphemous for L&D people, but really, if you think about how we're going to survive the robot apocalypse, what skills are going to be at the forefront? It's basically our ability to think, to be creative, and to problem solve. That's how we can still differentiate ourselves and how we can still, really contribute. When we have, I promised people I wouldn't geek out too much about this, but when you think about your brain in very simplistic terms, there's only so much juice in there, and you can actually spend that, like the amount of energy you spend on things like willpower, on working memory and problem solving, all come from the same battery pretty much. So, if you are trying to have a box of chocolates there and saying, no, I'm not going to eat that, not going to eat that, as you're trying to study, you'll study worse. Similarly, if you're trying to just use that working memory to load up and that cognitive load is there, you're going to have less room for thinking and being creative. So kill knowledge. This whole idea of putting out e-learning modules to try to stuff people's brains full of facts has just got to end, and we've got to lead that to start with, particularly now since the world's changing, but always. The other element of this is that training isn't always the answer. So this already explains it better than I could, so I'll just let you read it for a few seconds. So I did this cartoon a little while ago to help explain the challenge that we have, is that when people come to you and you're ready to take their order and they say, please do this training, deliver this training, the question whether training is an appropriate approach to the solution or whether they can get performance outcomes through another means is usually not asked. So that question of focusing on performance is now at the forefront. So if we shift away from our knowledge obsession and we focus on performance, then a whole bunch of opportunities come. Training might be part of that, but it might not be, or it might just be one small part of that. Performance tools or other changes within the context of that person's workflow might be have the bigger impact. So again, when you free yourself from the knowledge obsession that we've been a part of, so many more doors open up in terms of innovation. The other thing is it's known to get results. So my go-to place is Towards Maturity, and I want to plug them right now because I think they've got I'm not sure, a lot of you would have heard of Towards Maturity, but they do a benchmarking process where as an organisation you can go in and sign in and talk about what your organisation does, and it's benchmarked against thousands of organisations these days about what they're doing. And it's actually free for the next few days, I believe. Hopefully it's still free. But it's something I'd really recommend you do because they use those benchmark reports to give us these wonderful statistics. So for example, the top high performing companies, there was when companies did embrace learning innovation, and there's more, if you look at that Google link down the bottom, and I think these slides are going to be made available, you can see more detail about what that actually meant, but there was at least a 12% increase in productivity from companies who were having an approach of learning innovation. And similarly, 94% of those top performing companies had a view of learning and performance outside of courses, which is interesting because I'm guessing a lot of your experiences would still be people coming to you and saying, we need courses, and having that sort of mentality. But certainly of the top performing companies, it's certainly shifted internationally anyway. So that's the sort of frame of why innovate learning, and hopefully, I guess just to round that out, it's because the world is changing, that we never should have focused just on knowledge. We focused on knowledge because it was easy to package, easy to test, and we lost sight of the fact that what the real game is about performance. Beyond that, I think the fact that with the rise of AI and other sort of things that are snapping at our heels, if you like, our role as humans has got to become more human, and we've got to focus more on how we think and how we actually are innovative. So what's that actually looking like in industry at the moment? I think 70-20-10, while it's been around for a while, 70-20-10 has got a massive role to play. When you talk about informal learning, it's hard not to talk about 70-20-10. And again, it's not about the numbers. The only reason some people use was exposure, education, and experience. Thank you. As the catch cry. I still like to use 70-20-10, not because I'm tied to the numbers, but I like to emphasise, because I feel like we're in a change management process, we're still in that sort of period of drawing attention to the fact that formal shouldn't be our obsession. So when you've got that little slither of 10% formal, even though it's not scientific yet, it's 10%, it still just draws attention to the fact that there's a whole world outside of courses and e-learning that we need to explore. That's why I keep it there. But I think the point is embracing, whatever you want to call it, embracing informal learning, the 3 E's, 70-20-10, it's on the agenda. And a big part of that is this idea of trying to burst the bubble, of rather than seeing ourselves as people who are delivering this little training bubble outside of work. And these days, the first step is really trying to deliver it into work. So that's where micro-learning comes in, where people are delivering learning in a more consumable way, that in the workflow people can actually pull that learning more effectively. But the real challenge for us, I think, is how can we actually draw more learning from the work? And that's that Darush quote, Harold Darush, was it learning is work, work is learning, and really trying to tie those two together. Workflow learning, again, I go towards maturity for my numbers, has been shown to have a massive impact. You can just see the stats there for yourself if you like, in terms of finding workflow learning essential or useful. The collaboration from peers, 90% people finding that, and certainly I'm sure if you reflect on your own experience of what's been useful, I'm sure that will show out as well. And also in terms of being faster to respond to change, being able to improve staff motivation and customer satisfaction. They're great outcomes, and that report's worth a look if you're trying to mount a business case for some of this more innovative approaches to learning. What learning then looks like is, rather than courses or traditional just rollouts, they become often ecosystems. Sometimes they become more long-term experiences. Sometimes they become campaigns. That what they look like can really vary. I think it's partly us not being too obsessed about having a sense of what the end picture is going to be. It's just trying to keep your eyes on the prize of that performance outcome. And in terms of an ecosystem, that's something that doesn't just have a finite time. It's really about having a sense of, even if you think about your job and your performance levels, if you think about your performance levels now, what could contribute to that performance beyond a course, beyond you going and hitting your boss for a 2-day course somewhere, which may be the way to go, because that could help you network and it could actually draw some really useful outcomes. But beyond that, how can you expand your collaborative network? How could you actually, is there a portal or is there some sort of tool that you could use, a platform? Or what sort of just-in-time tools can you create? It's a really simple process, but if you actually start thinking of you as your ability as something that's affected by you and your ecosystem, as opposed to just what's in your head, it can really expand what you're capable of. And part of this too, this way innovation is happening is actually through technologies as well. I do this for myself every few months, and I find it keeps changing. Like I basically try to chart on every few months I try to work out what I'm going to focus on, how I'm going to develop myself over the next 3 months or so. And partly I am a bit of a geek, so I like to try to focus on some technologies, and I try to prioritise by doing this idea of what's the potential impact and what's the current maturity. And I disagree with myself every few months, so I'm not expecting you to agree with it. But for example, what I've got down there, I've got wearables pretty low on the actual impact, and this is in a learning context. I just don't feel like, except in very particular contexts of health and so on, I don't see wearables as playing a huge role. Chatbots, I think, are great, and they're quite mature now. Chatbots is, you probably experienced it from your what do you call it? Your phone operator, where you've talked to a customer service person, and then you get a thing saying, how did you find that? Can you rank it? And you put a 0, and then it will give you a response based on that, and you have a conversation with this machine just on your phone. So there's actually a few companies now happening where we're actually looking at a solution for chatbots for an induction program starting up next month, where people are just getting these messages and they can have conversations with them, and it's actually quite affordable, it's quite easy. Does it make a huge impact on learning? I think it will for a period. I think at a certain point people are going to get overwhelmed with text messages, just like they got overwhelmed by email. So I think there's a bit of a window that we can sort of cash in, but then I think it's going to get a bit sour. VR and AR are the biggies, and it's interesting. Even after Pokemon Go, I still only had AR up there. Because I've always had VR a bit more than AR, because I still think using VR, I think AR is great if you're, like, for example, putting someone if it's got a physical context to it, like if there's a sense of someone who's learning off a particular machine, if there's a new office space that you're exploring, AR is brilliant. But in terms of most office workers' experience, I still find that AR, like we've got VR and AR partners, and it's always in my head to possibly use it, and I always end up talking, not always, we've just did our first VR shoot last month, but I often talk ourselves out of using it just because it's not going to add enough value, because it hasn't got a physical context to it. It's not really paying for itself. I think VR has got a really interesting scope. I think just as Pokemon Go has brought AR into the front of people's minds, I think as PlayStation and some of these other gaming platforms are releasing their new headsets and their new games, which are going to be VR based, I think we're going to experience a bit of like an explosion around VR as well. But the technology's there. It's actually cheaper than it's ever been. It's actually it's more mature than you'd think. It's just that culturally we haven't quite caught up with how to use it effectively. But for example, we're working with this induction program, which is basically going to be like a seat at the table where you meet the executive board of an organisation through Google Cardboard. Just you whack on Google Cardboard. Suddenly you're sitting at a table with all the chief executives of the company talking about themselves and talking about what their vision is for the company, and you can just wander around and have a look at it. So yeah, that's the project we're working on at the moment, which is, you can see that those sorts of things can really add a lot of value, and really, particularly induction, trying to make people feel like they're part of something. But for me, the big ones in terms of impact are AI. I think it's the least developed in terms of maturity, and by AI I mean having some real smarts behind responses, behind actually, so that Deakin here, we work with Watson. And Watson's actually put out, Watson's the one that won Jeopardy years back. So Watson is still around and growing, and it's hopefully not going to turn into Skynet and kill us all. But in the meantime, it's actually answering questions for university students and trying to be quite intuitive in terms of when someone's asking questions about, oh, this is what they actually want before they're actually asking it, because it has information about where they are and what context they are and what they're studying and so on. So it can try to preempt some needs there. I still think the level of maturity around those sorts of things and ability to be deployed in a learning context is still pretty immature, but I think the promise is pretty big for that. XAPI for me is the big one to watch because it's there, the technology is pretty mature. I put it down as less mature, not because the technology is actually really simple. XAPI, it's basically saying, David attended this presentation and did this. It's basically just a statement, really. That's all XAPI in its base element really is, but it's how you use that and how you tie that to performance data. So for example, the people who came here, if that's tied to other performance data about your jobs and how you're actually performing there, and there's actually correlations between, we know that when you go to these seminars with Arun, it actually has no impact on your job whatsoever, then you're actually getting data on that rather than just this sort of feel-good kind of sense. So I think that feedback loop that you're getting between what people are actually doing, what they're achieving, and what they're looking at. And that combined with the AI stuff, my colleague Cameron, he's working on some of this stuff, and for example, he's using an API off Watson. Sorry, I'm just going to go a bit ticky now. An API off Watson, which actually scrapes articles and photos and actually generates what they're about. So he showed me, he had all these photos flashing up, and the Watson API was just there telling us what was in the photo. And so the way that could be applied is someone like myself could be browsing LinkedIn or browsing whatever, looking at articles and then actually doing other things, and it scrapes it will work out, is this relevant to my job? And if it is relevant to my job, it can then look at what impact that has on my performance over time. So rather than me just favoriting things, that could be a factor as well, but it could actually start tying what behaviors I'm doing to what performance I'm creating, and then try to translate that for other people to share. So it's really trying to bottle high performers and try to get data around that. So I did want to dwell on that one a bit because for me that's the one that really stands out for me. AR, VR, yeah, please come to us for jobs like that because they're really fun. But XAPI for me, with that data approach to learning and performance, the thing it's waiting on is the cultural change. Like anything with big data, the challenge is we don't know what questions to ask. We don't know there's not the cultural link there between, okay, how do we actually measure that performance? So it's almost, we've got to play catch up with the technology on that. But having said that, that's the sort of promise, 70-20-10, great technology, it's all really fun and games until it isn't. And there are fail points around 70-20-10, and I wrote quite an extensive, it was almost a cathartic piece I wrote called Why 70-20-10 Fails and What We Can Do About It. If you want to Google that, I've written quite a lot, it was quite a big article. And some of the key fail points that we've found were that, and this was back in the day when we were coming up with these solutions, we would talk to a client, we would do a bit of investigation, we would do a content workshop, and then we'd say, yep, this is a solution, and we'd roll it out to them. And so, for example, one of the solutions was that the L&D team we were talking with, this was a big induction program, 70-20-10, we cut down like a 25-day program into a blend which had like 4 days of face-to-face. And it worked really well for a period. And we were told by the L&D team that there'll be these 60 new managers coming in and they'll be able to really support this on-the-job learning. There was badges, there was all this on-the-job stuff. Turns out that the key executive that was pushing that left. The managers came in, half of them weren't even briefed about this program and the fact that they actually had a lot of moving parts to administer, and it pretty much fell apart slowly, quite rapidly in parts of it. The teams that were still using it, the managers that were still engaged with it, went really well, but the other ones, it just was coming apart at the seams. And it was partly us not working out that ecosystem enough to work out what was really going to land. Similarly, we did another job. I don't want to say that all our stuff fails, but I'm really keen to see fail points to learn from this. This was about 3 years ago now. We did another job where there was we did this blend, and it was one of the things, it's all about micro learning. It's all about spaced repetition and forced recall over time. That's how we get learning rather than just in one hit. So we were doing these 20-minute webinars over a period of about 5 weeks. We get a call from the delivery team about 2 weeks into the program and saying, oh yeah, that was a bit too hard to administer, so we've just done a 3-hour webinar up front, and just letting you know. So again, we didn't even think about the delivery team, and we, the stakeholders that we were working with in that organisation were totally on board, and yet we didn't incorporate that sort of thinking. So these fail points, and there's a few, are there executives on board, are the managers really on board, or is it just our impressions? That's what led us to design thinking, because we were innovative. It's not hard to innovate. What's hard to do is to innovate with a real practical, pragmatic approach as well. So you can be creative, but then to bring in that sort of pragmatism, is it actually going to work on the ground? And to almost innovate from that place on the ground. So design thinking I'm going to go through pretty quickly because I think many of you will be aware. There's lots of stats like this about the impact design thinking has on broader organisations. I've got the picture of the bike there because I like the case study of Shimano, where they did the Shimano gears on bikes, and they did a design thinking process, and they discovered that people were totally intimidated by bikes in bike shops because they had all these gears and it looked so technical, and yet most people had really great memories about riding a bike as a child. And so they through that process, they actually created a cruiser series, which is a really simplified bike, which looks really modern, but it tries to bring you back to your childhood as well. And that's gone really well. And so there's many examples like that. There's great case studies. Also, it's not a design thinking thing, but I really was inspired by this quote from Einstein about if you had a problem to solve, and that he would actually spend 55 minutes focusing on what the problem is before he actually focuses on the solution. And it's not that design thinking does that. It doesn't have to be weighted that way. But even just asking, is this the right problem? Are we asking the right questions? Because that's often what doesn't happen when someone just comes and says, can you take my order, please? So there are 4 key mindsets from my point of view, and there's lots more, but there's 4 mindsets that really stand out for me for design thinking. One is that you're starting from empathy, that you're really, so in these circles where you've got desirable, human-centered, business need, and tech and what's possible from a technical point of view, you're really starting from that human-centered point of view. And I think that one's so a lot of the design thinking stuff we've been inspired by IDEO, by D-School, and even a bit by Frog Design. That's sort of 3 big players in the design thinking world. Fail faster for us is huge, that you're actually trying to get things out as fast as possible with as little investment as possible and see if it fails quickly rather than having that big, that some of the examples I gave you, if we'd done some quick prototyping and actually tested out with managers beforehand what was the reality beyond what we were being told, we would have discovered this much more effectively. That holistic view. So in learning, we're so used to being point sensitive, but in any solution, from people designing a shopping cart as opposed to seeing what the whole experience of a web browser, of that web experience is. So rather than just taking that little point sensitive view, you're actually looking at the whole journey. I think that's one of the crucial steps for design thinking. And you're starting to look in context. So you're not just looking at we are learner-centric, we're unashamedly learner-centric, but now we're also starting to be delivery-centric and manager-centric. We start from a learner perspective, but we also look at that whole context, the other touch points and so on. And collaborative. For me, the key thing about this process, the one that we've now adopted, is it's very visual. It's people love it. When we actually do it, the tables are full of, we often use this room, the tables are full of sticky notes and cards and blue tack, and it's actually, rather than just trying to spend ages trying to explain an idea, you're getting it up on the walls, or the windows in this case, very quickly. You're sorting through information incredibly rapidly. I've been involved in scoping meetings before where you've got your 50 questions. Now when we're doing them, they just happen, they go really fast, and people are actually feeling quite energised by the end. People look like they were zombies by the end of the old ones I used to run about 5 years ago. So it's just very visual and very engaging process, and it's a great way to engage people more effectively. So this is the classic process, not refine at the end really, but the D-School would use empathy, define, ideate, prototype and test as their sort of process. IDEO and Frog, they all use versions of this. And the idea is that you're going through a process of flare thought, divergent thinking, and then convergent thinking. So it's not just all about being creative. You're being creative when you're starting with empathy, but then you're going to a definition point, and then you're flaring out when you're ideating, and then you're going back in when you're actually building something to prototype and to test. So this is the end piece, which is talking about how we're using it, which is getting a bit more concrete about our processes and our experiences. So one of the first projects we did this with, we've sort of incorporated bits and pieces for a while now, but we really ran for it up front with what was effectively a change campaign. It was around a company who was setting up a value proposition and creating quite a change campaign around that value proposition, which touched on all the organisation. And so we did a series of workshops with what became a champion group, and we designed this. This is the guts of the solution that ended up happening, where basically there was some more videos in it and so on. But the key thing really was that we created a cascading workshop model, which then teams would actually go and deliver to their smaller group, like managers would deliver to their smaller groups, and in that process they would have team toolkits, team commitments, learner-generated video stories. But one of the key strengths of that process that I found in this particular case was the champion group. I went to some of these cascading workshops and there was always a champion in there, and you could just see them walking tallly, like the sense that I've done co-design before, but not through, when I didn't do it through a design thinking process, the people who we co-design with were sort of part of it, but they almost felt a bit like spectators. Whereas the ones that came to this process, they really had an ownership. They weren't even looking at me. They were saying, yeah, I was part of it. I did this. We were almost like irrelevant to them because we were almost like the midwives more than anything. So we're doing it with our enterprise leadership product, which is we've done it with Deakin University, and now we're offering this out to the broader industry, where basically we used design thinking to design the model. But interestingly, I think here is that we've got this product, if you like, which is a blended learning experience for leadership, but we're actually up front, we're doing a design thinking process to really understand the audience more and actually customize the journey for them more. So rather than just trying to say, yes, this is a leadership model, we're just throwing it on, we still are up front doing that design thinking process to really uncover insights about the audience group and to really understand them more effectively. But one of the best examples for me came with a compliance job that we had, and there's some people from the organisation that we did this for, and I think it's being launched effectively, and I think training's happening today around it, where the original job came to us and they said, we have a series of insurance brokers, and we want to have 9 e-learning modules, and we had to go into tender for this. We had to pitch against other organisations to do this, and we were full of the fervour of design thinking at this point, so and performance. So we decided to not give them what they asked for, and we were saying, no, we are not going to be order takers. And so instead we said, we'll pitch for something else. We'll pitch for something which might have like 3 e-learning modules and some other performance-based tools. But the key thing is we're suggesting we do a design thinking process. That's the really thing that we really want to do with them to engage. But we put that solution forward as an idea of saying this is the sort of thing we might end up with. And what was really surprising for us and really brilliant for us was that the key stakeholders that we were working with were more than excited to go with us on that journey. And they were really excited by this different approach. Even though they'd asked for e-learning modules, they were really keen to actually explore this different option. And so we went through that design thinking process and looking at brokers and understanding where they're coming from and so on. And instead of the e-learning modules, in the end, we actually are building a sales tool. And so the sales tool is effectively helping brokers to sell and to make more money. But if they sell and make more money using this tool, using the interview guide in this tool, then they will be compliant. So it's a performance focus which is actually making them compliant, which is quite for people who haven't been inflicted upon by compliance in the past, that might sound, well, duh. But for people who know about compliance, that's such a massive change. But yeah, this for me is one of the things that design thinking can actually help do by actually having that exploration, by actually stepping back and saying, are we asking the right question in terms of how can we make our e-learning more engaging, which was the original kind of questions that we were asking, to step back from that and actually ask, well, what do these brokers actually want and why aren't they being compliant and what's going on here? They were trying to take shortcuts, they were trying to do it in their own way, and they didn't want to get bogged down because they had to generate that income. So this solution was a learner-centric one that actually met business needs as well. So the process that we use now, we use a design thinking approach with everything that we do. So it might be that it's a short three-hour piece, which we do a design thinking piece, and we did that with a bank previously, where we were coming from a human-centered point of view, and they were doing money laundering, and they were talking about how, according to their records, we discovered as we delved a bit more from that human-centered point of view, that apparently, according to their records, 40% of their audience their customers were acrobats, and it turns out that when that drop-down menu comes up, the default thing is acrobat. So, and when we actually interrogated that more, the front staff were basically trying to do their customers a favour. They're busy lunch. They didn't want to hassle them. They just wanted to quickly get through. So they just put acrobat and let them move on. So they were trying to be customer centric. And so we did, as part of an e-learning module, we talked about the hidden cost of acrobats and talked about how that it could create personality. What do you call it? The fraud where you get your personality stolen, or your identity. Thank you, identity theft. So, just trying to, again, coming from what's the WIFM for them, which was trying to be customer centric, and we tried to get a solution based on that, on where they were coming from. So it's trying to understand the audience group. But our ideal process is these 3 workshops, and we still use the same sort of process that I talked to earlier. I was trying to make it simple, and I'll just quickly go through this to end. What we do now is the first point I've really seen is that unless there's new data on the table, you're not going to get innovation. So, for example, if it's the same people in the room with the same ideas and the same preconceptions of what's going on out there, you might do a really brilliant brainstorm meeting and you might get something, but the real strength comes from just taking that moment to dig a bit deeper and go a bit beyond that room. And so what we're trying to do, often we have these workshops with 15 people, we'll actually get them to do interviews with 3 people each. And those interviews will be a set number of questions, and we'll really get them to ask why and to dig deeper and to try to get to those underlying needs. In the workshop itself, we actually quickly sort through that using card sorts. We theme them, we gather insights from them, and we use those insights to create personas. I found 3 to be the magical number with personas. I've experimented, and 3 seems to really work in terms of how we can just get a workable solution going. The slight difference between traditional design thinking here is with personas, we work out the end goal as a group, and this is where we use a bit of Kathy Moore action mapping. I'm not sure if any of you have seen that, where we basically look at Kathy Moore we look at where they're at now, what the aim is, and what the gap is. Do they need more knowledge? Do they need more skills? Do they need more motivation? Or is it the environment that's blocking them? And then from there, that becomes the problem statement. We've got a real clear definition. And then we allow, that's basically the first workshop. So the interviews, and then we do the personas, and we do the definition at the end of the first workshop. After that, people have got the problem in their head, and it's great practice for ideation for people to sleep on it. It's great practice for them to do some personal ideation first. So that's where we have a gap. People can go away and mull on that. Then they come back into the group ideation, and that's where we let that run for a while before we also throw in some expert advice. Because we're still learning professionals, we've still been exposed to a lot of technologies and stuff. We let the group go for a while, and then we'll throw in some other ideas as well and see how that goes. By the end of that second workshop, we've ranked and prioritised some solutions that people want to work with, and we prototype them. Prototypes are low fidelity. They often are sketches. They're just ideas, they're concepts, but they're something visual. And the idea is that group then goes out and takes that to their workforce and tests it out. So one of the big changes I've made recently is, rather than saying, can you test out this prototype, we say, I give them the prototype and say, can you find out more about the audience group? And so that's quite a different mindset, because rather than just trying to defend a prototype, they're actually trying to understand and use it. It's like another bite at the interview process. And so that's the field testing, where people are doing that on the ground. We often have a week between that second and third workshop. The third workshop is really the business end, where we bring that all together, we refine accordingly, we create a journey map, so we have that whole picture. We do a sustainability check. That's where we check off, how's it going to work for managers, how's it going to work for delivery. We do that we bring back the feasibility and the viability of it. And then we also look at impact and effort. We often do impact and effort grids and so on. And from that, we create a plan. And our plans now, it's previously when we did a plan, like a program overview, we call it, it used to just be the stuff that we build. Now we write this plan of everything that needs to exist. Like, you need a comms plan here, and you need a game changer in-house to do this. and then our bits are mixed in, but you've got a whole view of the whole solution, because now we're looking at the whole solution. It's not just that we're just building this one little course to drop in there. So that process has taken a while to develop, and I've found it to be incredibly transformative, to the point where we're talking about one solution now where we're not doing this, and I'm starting to get anxious because we're not doing this and we're not going through that whole process of actually drawing out those insights and failing faster and so on. So that's where I'll leave it. I've gone slightly too long, more than I was hoping, for questions. But I guess the key takeaways here is that, that performance focus, if you start from that point of performance focus, it leads you to designing ecosystem and blends and 70-20-10. If you want to do that effectively, you can be the sort of person who gets it right more than often, and you might get lucky and you could do it effectively. But if you want more reassurance that you're actually hitting the mark and you're actually trying to understand someone's workflow, you're trying to get in their head and understand what's actually happening for them in a day, I think design thinking is a brilliant way to do that and to really innovate those solutions from that human-centered approach, rather than just coming in from, I think this would be a good idea, or I want to use VR, or whatever the other criteria you happen to be using. And particularly with design thinking, if you had two takeaways for it, for me it's starting through empathy, innovating through empathy, and this idea of failing faster. But do feel free to hook up with me as well on any of these channels. Thank you. That's it.
Arun, thank you. Mark Nemes is my name. I do a lot of work in healthcare, and the concept of failing fast for them is, shall we say, I love the term failing fast as someone who's lost a lot of money and fell fast and fell quickly.
Yep.
What do you think are some strategies around that particular market sector? Is it basically trial? Is it a lab? What are some strategies in that particular market?
I think it's a great question. And look, for us, fail fast, we don't often say that to a client, even if there's that sense of it, because fail fast sounds pretty bad. But the idea, I think, there is just in your head, what's the lowest fidelity prototype you can create to test out this concept? And for us, that has often been, like for a coaching model, we tested out with someone drawing a stick figure comic book idea, which then they took out to key stakeholders. They took to managers and they took to people who were going to be coached. And that's the way we tested out that concept in a really low fidelity way. So, and that got canned straight away. It was really interesting. So the idea is, how can I spend least amount of time on this humanly possible and get some feedback on it? So it doesn't have to be this idea of minimum viable product and just trying to chuck it out there. It can be way before that. Looking at, so there's brilliant tools on D-School and IDEO, and just looking at the idea of how you can create some low fidelity prototypes, I think would be the way to go.
That's research.
Pretty much, yeah. But I wouldn't even talk about fail faster. I'd just create some really, really low fidelity prototypes to test out things.
Bob Sutton from D-School talking about this last week. And Bob Sutton's one of the founders of D-School, and he talks about this concept of innovation in organisations. And there's certain times where you want this innovation and this culture and so on, looking at the design thinking process, failing fast and so on. There's other units within your organisation for whom innovation is probably not where you want to be. And he used actually the example of a surgeon. And he said, you don't want your surgeon to be particularly innovative. There's a time and a place, and there's units to set up within organisations which are focused on innovation. And there's units to set up within organisations which are focused on stability. And it's actually making sure you've got the right teams together and you've got the right focus for what you're trying to achieve. So it's not that every team in your organisation needs to be innovative. In fact, it's probably the opposite.
Look, as you can see, Arun is very passionate and getting some tremendous results. So thanks, Arun, for sharing. Another round of applause, please.
Thanks.